an example would be great.
Sure. Well, and often, by the way, this has been very interesting to me. I don't know if both of you experience it, but the very first time you meet someone, a client or anyone really, but say a client, in the very first session, or certainly within the first 2 or 3, the whole story is already there, although it's implicit. I mean, it's not fleshed out, but so for example, there was a man I started seeing maybe a couple of years ago, and it was after he had a suicidal, I don't know if it was an attempt or a gesture, something like, so he was very down. So he's describing the situation, and what I do is often I call it returning to the scene. So I replay with him. Let's go back to exactly what happened that time when I even have a better example, but it's related. This happened even 20 years ago, where a man came to me because he had a gun, and he put it actually in his mouth, and he had the trigger cocked, and then he didn't pull the trigger. And so he was referred in the midst of, this depressive crisis. And so after, I met a couple of times, and then I said, can we return to that moment, that scene when you had the gun in your mouth? Would that be all right? You don't have to, it's okay if it's too, no, he said, yeah, I'd like to do that. So I guided him, said, let's close our eyes and just vividly go back to that moment when you had the gun in your mouth, okay? And just be aware of what comes. Nothing may come, but let's see what happens, if anything. Because something came that made you want to pull the trigger, but not pull the trigger. Something happened. So he stopped and he reflected. And then he had this shout out inside. He said, I feel something in me crying out, help me, I can't do this anymore.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah, and then I said, oh, and you get a sense of this one. Oh, it feels like the young boy in me crying out, and then we went on from there. That was like in the second or third meeting. So in other words, in that one moment, there was a whole history that got embroiled into that. I can't go on anymore. So returning to a scene, Greg, is one way for me of actually living out the notion of the sort of existential or hermeneutic circle, that we're always coming back to something, that every forward movement also brings with it a coming back to something, if that makes sense.
Gathering or something.
And gathering or being called back. So if I try to do this happens.
Mm-hmm.
And so with this man, the whole journey was sort of set up right there, that his living had gotten split between this adult that's supposed to know what to do and go through life, and this burden building up inside, because he had no sense that there was another being, quote, living in him that was crying out for help, support, pain, this kind of thing. But those early moments led me to this sense that there is a drama. I think someone paraphrasing Merleau-Ponty said that once, that there's a drama in the living body of which we know nothing about. Something like that. So he was referring it more to that there's a primordial or pre-personal level or energy being that. So with this man I saw recently, it was similar. And what I felt very much was, I had an image in me of an 8-year-old boy who was crying out. And I shared that, and he said, wow, that's right. He said, it feels like my soul is crying. So that's a little bit of how I take the whole body work, but I add on to it or expand it, I guess, into a drama or a story or a narrative frame.
Mm,
So the body is not telling the story, it's actually showing it.
right.
You see what I mean?
I'm also struck by the carrying forward process, that when you invited the man with the gun to just be with it, that forward movement could come of the boy having a voice and saying, I can't do this.
Mhm,
Help the other person too. Um,
mhm.
that returning brings what you call spirit. And you might want to say a little bit more about that idea of bodying forth and spirit.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, and I actually learned that also from my psychoanalytic training. I had an amazing teacher back in graduate school who was he was a Kleinian analyst, and which may not mean that much, but he was just so precise. Everything was just very, nuanced, right? And I'd never seen someone that much precision. Every movement, everything, nothing escaped his notice. It was just fantastic. So bodying, and this was, I wouldn't say it's a critique of Genlin, but it's a curiosity more, because he put a lot of emphasis on the ing, experience is experiencing, an ongoing flow of engaged or felt sensing, right? Not experience, but the ing, right? Living, breathing. So to me, bodying is a natural extension of that, I would think. I mean, that's the way I took it. That,
I think he would love it, Glenn. He would be very happy with that.
well, that's good to know. Although I say I've had some, you guys knew him more and probably more in depth than I did. I met him and worked with him a little bit. But when I tried to introduce this whole body notion, if you remember, I would say, well, why can't you just start with letting the body move like this or something? He said, oh yeah, movement. That's very important. That's right, movement. He said, yeah, once you get a felt sense, you can let it move. And I said, no, what about the other way around? What if you're just moving and then something comes? He said, oh yeah, that's good too. Like this. So you can picture him like, anyway. But yeah, bodying to me means that our ongoingness is already embodied. I learned this a lot from David Michael Levin, who is, his book on the body's recollection of being is still one of my favorite treatises. And his notion in that, and he took it from Merleau-Ponty, is that there's an ongoing bodily bodying of energy or beingness. And so if we observe how the other is bodying their being or bodying their energy, we gain, to me, a lot of information about not only how they're living, but the background, the horizons, that's often not in awareness. In fact, almost never, right? But I'll give you another example, because I think examples help, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So, and this will actually illustrate another principle that to me is important, but so I have paid a lot of attention over the years to not just what people say, and I imagine both of you do similar, but how people are speaking, their way of presenting and being in the room or now on Zoom or whatever, but how they are. So let's say, and this actually has happened, someone comes into the room, and by the way, all of these situations have something to do with trauma. I have to put that in because to me, the link to the spirit is what trauma and traumatic events or situations, how they impact our ongoing spiritedness and actually lead to what you might call a dispirited state, where something is cut off from its life force or had to go into survival modes, etc. So this, for example, I worked with a guy for 10, more than 10 years, I'd say. And again, the very first session, I could see everything was there. Meaning that he had come into the session with his, well, it wasn't for him, it was couples work. They came in together. They seemed like a very nice, they didn't seem like had a lot of animosity. So I said, well, why are you guys here? You know, this kind of thing. And the wife said, well, yeah, we get along great day to day, but anything a little more intimate, whether it's a deep conversation or sexual, physical intimacy, nothing. Just like, no, there, she said, or something like that. So I looked over to the guy and I said, would you like to share anything about it? And his whole body just went into freeze mode, just stopped. So I stopped. I said, oops, okay, this is a sensitive, and it was right there that he said, you know what, I think I should see you individually. That's what he said, because I'm the problem. Well, I wouldn't say it that way, but okay, I'm happy to do that. And that was the start. But what was notable was the way he would communicate or not. He would come into sessions, right? And we would chit chat. Hi, how you doing? You know, I'm pretty personable. Anything, you know, you like to share. And this is uncanny, Greg. He would stop and say nothing. And I mean, for half an hour. And he wasn't meditating. He wasn't contemplating. He was just nothing. And I would sit and I would just channel what's going on in me, right? I didn't intervene, didn't say. I mean, eventually I would say, okay, Then I got to the sense that this silence was very important. There was something thick and deep in it. So then sometimes he would finally start to say something, right? It didn't have to be anything profound, just something, right? And this was the key thing. He would start talking and then stop in the middle of a sentence and just go silent again. I was like, wow. So this is what I'm getting to. So when I say it's the therapist, me, right? I'm the resource. So as I was paying attention, I felt my body like moving, like leaning in closer, right? Like, oh, he shared something. And then the energy that came in me was like a little boy. Where'd you go? What happened? Where are you? Like this. So this happened over a fairly long period of time. And finally, I don't know, there's a moment, a seminal or, whatever. And I said, can I share what's coming in me? And I shared, I said, I feel like this little boy who's like been left hanging. That was the energy, left waiting for the next word or the next something. And I gestured like, I feel like this. And for the very first time, he started tearing up and said something like, wow, I know you're, a good listener and you care, but this is the first time I actually felt like you got me as a child. That was my whole childhood, was just waiting for somebody to get me, because he was abandoned. I mean, he had a horrific childhood. But, one of the main was being abandoned. And he was left from one person to the next and shuffled all around. And then, he was abused. It was terrible. But this, right? I said, he said, I feel like you got me as a child. That's it. I was just waiting and waiting and waiting, like this. Wow. So that moment, you see, then opened up that there's a little boy inside of him and inside of me. And we sort of connected there in a, say, in a little more of a playful way, and it opened up a whole field. But this has happened numerous times in different ways.
You were being the interaction that could help that dissociated place of nothingness. You were the embodiment. You were bodying forward something there.
Right, and that's what we mean by his way of presenting was actually living out the story of his childhood, the way it had been taken up, you know. Yeah, what basically the principle is that we look for or be very observant of regularities, things that happen quite often, over and over, and don't interrupt them. I let them unfold. I mean, there's a whole play mode, which I haven't gotten to yet, but that's sort of the natural evolution of that. But for example, another phenomena that repeats is I had been working with a woman who had said she had been sexually abused, molested. I mean, another horrific early life, right? And so as she was like in her maybe mid-30s at the time or something, and she was very attracted. She was married, but she was attracted to men, had a lot of affairs and this kind of thing, and she felt horrible about it, but it just felt like this something she couldn't seem to get a handle on or a hold of. Anyway, she's telling me in the session, and what I do is I like to replay situations, but not just tell me about it. I like them to actually show what actually happened. So she was going through an interaction where she was telling me she went to a bar, for example, with the aim of maybe picking up some guy or something like that. I said, okay, well, show me what happened. And every time she would do this, her body would go into this, her arms would move like this, and she would lean like this. Now, she wasn't aware of this at all. She was just showing, I was at the bar and I was looking and like this. So one of the things I've learned over the years, and this has been from whole body work and drama work and somatic, is I don't just say back, I actually play back. I show the other what their body is doing. I mean, gently, I don't want to embarrass, make someone self-conscious, but I said, are you aware that whenever you do this, your body sort of goes like this? So maybe you and I can just stay with that, see what comes from that. She closed her eyes, and within, I don't know, a few seconds, something came. I said, just that whole posture, position. She said, anyway, she had a memory of being 3 years old, and her body was leaning over a window, and she was watching her father leave the house, knowing he was never coming back. He just left the family, right? And she was so attached to daddy, and he left. And then she, again, for the first time, started crying and had an actual embodied memory of that little girl yelling, "Daddy, daddy, daddy, don't leave me." So you see the iterations that came later with looking for men and affairs and shame and grief are all encapsulated in that.
That gesture.
Yeah, but without an other to pick that up, right, and play it back and help someone live it further or deeper or fuller, it would just stay in the background, right? So, and I would say most of these sort of evolved empirically, meaning I wasn't thinking of a particular method, like, oh, this is focusing, oh, this is whole body, oh, this is somatic, or this is relational. No, it just sort of I just observe what's happening, and somehow I feel it is meaningful. I don't know what the meaning is, but I feel like anything regular repeating, has a lot of energy build up.
That's interesting to me. I think if I could just respond to a couple of things there. One is picking up that it's meaningful. I feel like if I was in a bar and I saw somebody doing that, looking around like that, I would think that's meaningful. There's something meaningful about that, even though, of course, I would have no idea of where it comes from in terms of story. That was clear to me, that you're picking up on, you can sense there's the beginning of a story here. There's something that's trying to be revealed or understood or received or something, or lived further. The other thing that I was thinking as I was listening to you is the examples you've given, even though they're of trauma, and not every client is dealing with trauma, but the examples that you gave, I thought, yeah, I can relate to that. None of it felt very unfamiliar to me. But what I was thinking was, but there's something about the way you're working with someone that is probably not always, but sometimes I'm sure would be slightly different than the way I would. And what I was thinking then is that the three of us, we can say that our work is crossed with, psychoanalytic, existential, whole body, whatever. But in fact, what I'm thinking is probably it's just the work is crossed with us. And it's something about who we are as people that we carry the story in a slightly different way, pick up the story in a slightly different way, and it unfolds partly in reference to our unique beings.
Right.
I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. Lynn, did you want to?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And I think that the approaches that we're attracted to, that we want to incorporate, are the ones that bring something out in us that is essentially, part of us.
Yeah, Greg, it makes a lot of sense. And I can tell, for me, Greg, what it brought up, it's a very important point, that I can tell when I'm doing a method, and so can the client, really, even focusing, oh, you're just doing that, or you're therapizing, and that feels very different in my body when I'm just engaged. I call it in the spirit of play. Doesn't mean I'm actually playing, but that spirit is when I feel most me, and when I'm in the spirit of seriousness, let's say, which has to do with a goal, for example, or check a box, or focusing is everything, you know what I mean? Then I'm off. I just feel like I'm trying.
Right. Yeah, I think that improvisation is that spirit of play that can be very, very serious, but it's the spirit of courting surprise, taking risks, being in it. But I'm thinking that I like to make the distinction between technique and skills. That technique is sort of like your being this machine that does this or something, but skills are more embodied, and you learn them. And I could imagine when I was reading your examples or listening to you today, with a particular client, I was thinking about, oh, I'm going to be Glenn, and I'm going to say to him, let's stand up and see, and that wouldn't be just a method. It would be improvisational, but I would be expanding my improvisational skill set and trying on something. And I can imagine it being very alive, and I can imagine that the client would probably know that this wasn't my thing, that I was trying something new, and that would be okay, that might even add to it.
It might
Absolutely.
be okay.
Greg,
I said it might be okay.
it
It
might be,
might not be okay.
might be
Um,
okay.
I could imagine you doing it. I could imagine I would have to really, if I were to work in the way that Glenn was just describing, I would have to be, and I think for moments I do similarly, maybe not quite the same, but I have to really feel touch.
Mm,
If I'm doing it because, I've heard about it in supervision or I've just heard about it from Glenn, it would be a little bit hollow, and I wouldn't be standing on enough in some way. I would be it would just feel a little bit artificial, and I'm concerned the client would pick up on that and either try to help me make it work, or else
uh,
sort of take a step back and think this guy doesn't know what he's doing, which would be true. But if I go back to what Glenn was saying for a second, it felt like you were it's a really important point that I think you're making, that you're not uh, applying
mm,
a kind of an agenda
mm,
that comes from a workbook on how to work with clients or something like that. You're
Mm.
somehow waiting with the client until you're moved in some way. It's like something arises in you that is directly in response to what is or isn't happening in the client. And the way that I would say that, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that you're moved
Mhm.
in some way. You're moved. And I think you use the word spirit,
Mhm.
that something comes alive that, from my own experience of whole body focusing, I would say that the experience can sometimes be something comes alive that is almost anonymous. It somehow is living through me, but isn't from the me that I normally think of as me.
mm.
Yeah, I think that resonates, Greg, with my experience. Yeah. Um, and Lynn, also, there is an expanding, that
Mhm.
it's basically, if the more authentically and genuinely we're moved and touched, right? And then but then also that to me, part of the hallmark is myself being vulnerable, being
Mhm.
open to being moved and being wronged, and inviting like an inner being in the other to share with me how this whole thing just felt, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah, for example.
Thinking about that. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I'm thinking about that idea of being moved that you introduced, Greg.
Mhm.
And it seems very central. It seems like we are trained and train ourselves to be sensitive to the movements in us, to the felt sense. And then the felt sense, an inkling of something, can be expanded and allowed to move us. And it seemed like in your examples, Glenn, you were doing that. It was you
Mhm.
came in touch with something that was a felt sense, but then letting that felt sense move you into and articulating the void that you felt, or um,
Mhm.
the next place. And that's improvisational, I think,
Mhm.
allowing the felt sense to move you and to kind of go with it, even though you haven't thought it out yet. You're going with something that is yet to be really thought through.
Yeah, absolutely. If I could add one thing there, part of being moved, or my sense is that I like to not only offer possibilities for how we process, but the very nature of our interaction allows more possibilities, like something that just didn't seem possible.
Mhm.
Here, we can have that be a possibility. So someone who never was able to say no or to anyone can tell me no, for example, as you know, that. So expanding possibilities is one. And even something, I learned this from drama work and Gestalt a little bit, is role reversal, where if our living body is interconnected or one large system, I've had many situations where I've invited or the client, see if would it be okay if we switched.
Mhm.
Like I had a guy once who was about to leave therapy because he just said, this isn't, I don't know, it was something I didn't know exactly. And it turned out, unbeknownst to me, is the chair I was sitting in and the couch he was sitting on, my chair was higher up than his, it was like this, right? And so his energy was all like, and it replayed a dominant father kind of dynamic, right? And so I invited, well, what if we switch? You sit in the therapy chair, I'll sit in your chair, see what happens. Sure. Yeah. That's the spirit of play. I don't know what's going to happen, but let's see. Well, it was an amazing experience. I felt that kid in him like this.
Mhm.
The chair was higher up. I never realized this, The point being that, yeah, there's an energy exchange is the way, like, or interchange.
Yeah.
That brings more to both of us. That's genuine and real. And yeah, and very moving, To me, isn't that, Greg, what I would say is soul work, is that you're moved, you're touched, right?
The way, yeah, yes, I mean, I think it can be described that way. I think of it as just the more anonymous shared level of existence that we're not so separate and so different from one another. It's anything that a human being can experience somehow, even though it can be so drastically different from my life experience. Often there's something in there that I recognize as human and it touches me.
Mm-hmm.
I may or may not share it, but it probably touches something in my own story as well that I could potentially share. But I want to just ask quickly, thinking of what you just described, and I remember working with a client where we swapped. The client insisted on swapping chairs. So we did, he had this thing where he would sit in his chair and then he would, while sat down with his heels, he would push himself all the way to the wall. So he was as far away from me as possible.
Mm-hmm.
So he did that. And then he said, I want to sit in your chair. And so I said, okay, fine. So we swapped chairs. And as soon as I sat in his chair, I dragged it all the way back. And it was quite playful. But that's what I was thinking when I was listening to you. And I was thinking, but all of my work is online now. And I'm wondering, I don't know if you work online, but if you do, have you found ways of incorporating some of the more playful sort of role playing and stuff? Can you do that online?
Yes. Uh-huh.
Okay.
Yeah, clearly, I mean, the actual physicality, right, and palpability of being in the same physical space is lost.
Yeah.
So sure, it's not as juicy, let's say, but still, I sort of try to connect with it or invite it just the same as if we're in the room. One thing, by the way, that happens with some clients is they go off the camera or shut off the video, and that kind of frees them to, explore. And some of the explorations in this bodying work are imaginal. They're all about, like, I have one guy I work with who continually gets images of being in a cave. And so we explore the cave together. But this is all off camera. I have no visual. And another woman, and we've set up a whole play space where she goes off camera, lays out a blankie, and we lay on the blanket together and we go on journeys. And, yeah, I love what you said about this anonymous life, or whatever we want to call it, energy, beingness that flows through all of us. Is that what you meant? Something like,
Yes,
yeah.
that is what I meant. And whenever I refer to it, I try to use, like Jean used to say as well, I try to use a handful of words so that the description doesn't get in the way of what it is I'm trying to point to. Because it kind of enters into a territory where there's a lot of loaded words already there.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The word anonymous, I knew what you were pointing at, but for me, it's the most personal. It's both anonymous and the most personal. So I would almost want to pair those.
How would you say that, Lynn?
That place where nothing human is alien to me, where we are interaction, is a place that's more than my personal story and your personal story and Glenn's personal story, but it also is the most deeply personal place. The least anonymous and the most anonymous at the same time, or something. I don't know.
Yeah, that's certainly my experience when I, especially in whole body focusing, if I'm practicing that, and I feel sometimes almost like it feels like life wants its vehicle back, and it kind of shoves me out of the way slightly in order to re-embody me, in kind of correct the mistakes, all that the hash I've made of my life in some way. The thing is, this is closer to what you're saying, Lynn. It feels like a slightly impersonal force that is at the same time knows me more intimately than I even know myself. It's somehow it's so deeply me, and yet not the me I normally think of as me. It's a different depth of me somehow.
That's that, yes.
That's beautiful. Great. Yeah, I would resonate with that also. I mean, when I use, for example, the term spirit, that's kind of what I'm referring to, really. That there's another term that's called autogenous, which means self-generated, basically. So it's an energy that just sort of comes of itself. Like you said, I love, sort of gets you out of the usual me out of the way, and that's why, the whole body and even play work, drama, they're all about that very thing, Greg. So I think you hit it, the crux of it. There's some energy, force, whatever we name it, right, that sort of has a life or a knowing of its own. And that the more we can engage that, allow it, invite it, embody it.
Right.
It's
me that's more than me, that comes through me. That place where we are our local selves, and we are this, interaction that includes so much more. Letting that so much more come through. Yeah. I love this little part of our discussion.
Reminds me, there's a poem, I forget the name, but if I find it, I'll send it. But it makes that very something about you meet the stranger who is yourself, and you look there, you see the you that the stranger has always known you, but you haven't known him.
It's love after love.
Oh, that's it. Yeah.
Right. You'll meet yourself at your own door, and you'll welcome them and eat and drink, and that a line about take the love letters from the wall,
Mhm,
eat, drink, feast on your own life. Very beautiful.
mhm.